The city sleeps, but sin never rests. Between wet alleys and broken lights, a woman walks alone, her eyes holding the quiet fire of someone who's lost everything except her courage. Isabella, to some, a legend, to others, a warning. Power made her feared, but love was what destroyed her. And when he appeared, fate had already been written, because some loves fade like moonlight, but never die. The night tasted of iron and rain. The city slept with its eyes open while sirens sliced through the sky like metallic prayers. Isabella walked among the wreckage, her dress torn, heel broken, gaze steady, untouched by the chaos around her. Each step was a sentence, each breath a silent command. The wind carried the scent of gunpowder and memory, blending past and present into a single breath. Beneath the flickering neon lights, the asphalt looked like a cracked mirror reflecting her fate. She hadn't inherited power, she had taken it. And now she defended it with blood and steel. Screams dissolved into the distance, muffled by the rain that fell like a curtain between her and the rest of the world. The echo of boots trailed behind, but no one dared to pass her. Isabella raised her arm, gave a short, cold order, and one enemy fell. Another fled, tripping over his own fear. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to make the night bow. Yet, through the smoke, a shadow caught her attention. A familiar face emerged from the darkness, one that shouldn't have been there. For a moment, time forgot to move. Her breath faltered, her heart took a step back. Ethan Vale, the name she had sworn to destroy. The man who embodied everything she hated, and everything she once loved. The gun grew heavy in her hand, not because of the metal, but because of the memories. The wind whispered old voices, forgotten promises, touches that still burned. Judy screamed for her to shoot, but something deeper begged for silence. She aimed, her finger pulled the trigger, and yet nothing happened. The sound of the rain grew deafening, every drop falling like a dragging second. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just looked at her, as if there was still something pure between them, something neither time nor blood had erased. Isabella felt the air lock in her chest, her heart hiding behind the armor of her own strength. The streets went silent. Even chaos obeyed. The city seemed to understand what was unfolding, as if it were witnessing a sacred kind of sin. The power that had always held Isabella upright wavered for the first time. She was Lorena, the woman the world obeyed. But standing before him, her throne felt cold, empty. Inside, something gave way. Outside, she kept her face made of marble and iron. Ethan took a step forward under the rain, and their eyes met like two open wounds. His face was marked by time, but his gaze still carried the same weight, the knowing of the soul standing before him. Isabella wanted to scream, to forget, to shoot, but everything melted into one long silence. The kind of silence that comes before love or tragedy. She lowered the gun for a moment, just long enough for the world to breathe again. The city spun in slow motion. Lights reflected in puddles, sketching stories only they could read. A thunderclap split the air, and the sound made her heart tremble. Ethan was still there, motionless, watching her with a look that held both guilt and tenderness. The memory cut like a blade. Her father ambushed, dead in the dirt, the vow of revenge. The path with no way back. He was the enemy, and yet the only person who ever looked at her without fear. Isabella felt the weight of the past and the taste of something she'd never had. Duty said one thing. Her heart said another. And between those two voices she heard her own, broken but alive. The rain was heavier now. Drops struck her face and slid down like tears she would never allow herself to shed. The whole empire waited for her signal. One shot would end it all. The story, the love, the destiny. But she didn't pull the trigger. Not this time. Because something stronger than hate had taken hold. Something she couldn't control, and that terrified her more than any weapon ever could. The radio cracked in her ear, demanding orders. She didn't answer. The sound vanished between thunder and memories. Ethan took another step forward, slow, almost reverent. The tension between them was a minefield, and every glance was a contained explosion. He whispered her name, low, rough, real. Isabella closed her eyes. The name sounded like both a curse and a prayer. Her hand trembled. Just slightly. Just enough for the universe to notice. And in that small motion, everything changed. Because empires could be rebuilt, but what was born there, between anger and desire, had no cure. Thunder rolled across the sky like applause from the gods, and silence returned heavier than before. Her men waited in the shadows. One of them asked, "Do we shoot, boss?" She answered with a single look that froze time. No, no one would shoot. She couldn't explain why, she just knew that, for some reason, the man standing alive before her was far more dangerous than dead. The wind blew, lifting her wet hair, revealing strength and fragility in the same frame. Isabella lowered her gun, and the city seemed to breathe with her. Ethan didn't move, didn't smile. He just stood there, under the rain, looking at her like a man who understood that the war was over, even if no one had won. The night stretched on, endless. No sound, no motion. Only two hearts on opposite sides, struggling not to admit they'd recognized each other long ago. The city surrounded them like a silent witness, aware that something had changed. And then came the question that hung in the cold air, like the final shot that was never fired. What was he doing there? And why couldn't she pull the trigger? She wasn't born for the throne was born for her. Isabella learned early that love doesn't protect, it exposes. When her father was killed in that ambush, the whole world watched her fall, and then rise again. No one could have imagined that the girl who wept at the coffin would become the woman who ruled an empire with an iron hand and a wounded soul. From that day on, no one called her by her name again. To everyone, she became only La Reina, the boss, the myth, the echo of a respected fear. The city changed when she took over. The streets that had once belonged to men now bowed to her presence. The shadows became her army, and silence her most loyal weapon. Isabella learned to speak little, but look deeply. Every word she spoke was a sentence. Every gesture, a revolution. Under the cold lights of casinos and warehouses, she ruled over time and fear. No man dared to challenge her. No man dared to love her. But power comes with a price that money can't pay. It collects in hours of lost sleep, in the soul, in loneliness. At night, when the halls emptied and the crystal glasses reflected nothing but silence, Isabella would stare out the window and see a reflection she no longer recognized. The face was the same, but the eyes. They belonged to a woman who had sacrificed her heart to keep an empire standing. They said she was cruel, but cruelty was just her way of staying upright. She knew that in a world of wolves, hesitation meant death. And still, somewhere deep within her, in a corner untouched by ambition, Isabella missed the warmth of touch, the sound of a voice, something that reminded her of what it was to feel alive. Maybe that's why she stared at fire so often, like someone studying an enemy they understood. In the alleys, her name was legend. In the high towers of power, it was a threat. Some feared her more than the police. Others desired her as if danger were a perfume. Isabella wore fear the way others wore necklaces, not out of vanity, but survival. And still, when the night wind slipped through her curtains, she remembered she was only a woman pretending her heart didn't weigh a thing. The throne had no cushions. It was built from sharp decisions. She could tell who would betray her before they did. She knew who lied just by the tone of their voice. She was the kind of woman who could destroy an empire with one word and rebuild it with another. And yet, there was no one to share the silence with. The walls of her palace held secrets even she didn't dare repeat. Some nights, Isabella walked the corridors alone, the echo of her heels ticking like a clock without hands. Power surrounded her but never touched her. There was a cold distance between who she was and who she pretended to be. Sometimes, When her fingers brushed across the furniture, she felt her father's absence, like a shadow that had never moved from its place. The men who served her saw a goddess. Her enemies saw a demon, but no one saw the woman behind those commanding eyes. No one imagined that behind the perfect posture and the steady voice was a heart tired of being a legend. Isabella kept her face serene, even when the weight of the crown burned. She had learned to smile without joy and to win without celebration. But fate has quiet ways of testing the strong, and it was already moving silently, preparing its next strike. Among her allies and spies, someone new would appear. Someone with a calm enough smile and dark enough intentions to go unnoticed. He would arrive slowly, as if asking permission, and plant doubt where she feared it most, inside her own heart. And within that fortress of steel and pride, Isabella didn't see the crack forming. Power kept her standing, but emptiness had already begun to seep in. As the days passed, a strange restlessness grew inside her, as if her soul itself was tired of being obeyed. "What is glory," she thought, "if no one dares to look you in the eyes?" She didn't know it yet, but the most dangerous enemy was already on his way. He wouldn't come armed. He wouldn't come with threats. He'd come with a look that echoed the past, and with it, the promise of a feeling she thought long buried. Because even the most ruthless queens have a blind spot, and hers had a name, a voice, and a mission that would destroy her. The night wind brushed the curtains in her office, dimming half the light. Isabella stood still, watching the reflection of her own shadow on the desk. For a brief moment she saw another version of herself, softer, more human. But a single touch on the phone, one more command given, and that woman vanished again. Lorena was back, the heart closed, and the game began anew. In the city's corridors, they said, nothing escaped her eyes. But there are things power cannot see. There are gazes that pierce even through thrones. There are feelings that, when they arrive, don't ask permission. And Isabella, the woman no one dared to defy, was about to discover that love, too, is a kind of war. Ethan Val entered her life the way rain seeps through the cracks of the city, without asking permission. He came in a dark suit, calm eyes, and a past wrapped in mist. They said he was an arms dealer, but no one really knew where he came from or what he wanted. Isabella watched him from afar, used to smelling lies before they spoke, and in him she sensed something different. He smiled rarely, spoke even less. And yet, he seemed to see beyond her armor, as if he didn't see Lorena, but the woman beneath. In truth, Ethan was an undercover agent, trained to deceive, manipulate, and bring down her empire from within. But nothing had prepared him for what he found. The plan was simple: earn her trust, get close, collect information, and when the time came, destroy her. He believed in that, until he saw her. Until he realized that the woman before him wasn't the monster they described. That behind the legend was a pain that spoke the same language as his own. At their first meeting, the air felt too heavy to breathe. Isabella kept her expression steady, but her eyes betrayed curiosity. Ethan pretended indifference, while secretly memorizing every detail of her. The faint perfume, the way she lit her cigarette without haste, the gaze that seemed to cut through everything. There was something dangerous about Isabella. Not because she threatened him, but because she drew him in. He shouldn't get close, but it was already too late. Danger, when it has a face, is impossible to ignore. In the days that followed, it became a game. He appeared in meetings, silent, observant. She tested him with questions that sounded harmless but hid traps beneath. Ethan answered carefully measured words, yet inside, something was slipping out of his control. It was like dancing with the enemy and forgetting the steps. Isabella watched him as if studying a mirror, and what she saw unsettled her. Truth. Sometimes their eyes met for a moment too long, long enough for the world around them to disappear. The hum of the city, the noise of bodyguards, all of it faded away. Only that thick silence remained, filled with questions neither dared to ask. Ethan was always the first to look away, afraid of what he might find if he didn't. Isabella, however, smiled faintly, the kind of smile that said she knew exactly the effect she had on him. In that silent war of glances, neither of them realized they had already lost. He began to let small bits of information slip, intentional, calculated, just to stay close. She pretended not to notice because she needed him as much as she wanted to control him. The empire kept turning, but between them stretched an invisible line ready to break. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. Ethan started questioning his own role. He was supposed to hate her. That's what his superiors said, what the reports dictated, what the mission demanded. But how do you hate someone who carries the same emptiness as you? Isabella trusted no one, and yet, little by little, she led him closer. A gesture here, a late-night conversation there, a silence shared between them. Small concessions that seemed insignificant, but changed everything. One night, on the terrace of the hotel where she met with her allies, Ethan found himself alone with her. The city below pulsed like an electric heart. Isabella stood with her arms crossed, staring at the illuminated horizon, and said, without turning, "Do you think everyone has a price, Mr. Vale?" He took a long moment before answering, and when he did, his voice sounded far too sincere. "I think some just sell themselves for something they believe is love." She smiled, not a smile of victory, but of memory. Something broke inside him then. The agent and the man began to blur. The orders he received no longer made sense. With every step he took toward her, the gap between duty and desire widened. Ethan knew he was doomed, but he didn't turn back. Sometimes we love precisely what we swore to destroy. Isabella, in turn, felt the empire shifting beneath her feet. Decisions came slower, certainties turned foggy. Ethan stirred something she thought she'd buried long ago. Trust. He made her remember what it felt like to be seen without fear, and that was too dangerous. Because to someone like her, love and weakness were one and the same. Still, he stayed close. He watched every move, every pause, and without realizing it, he began to protect her. Small actions that betrayed his mission, a warning before an ambush, a misdirected report that saved a life. He was playing both sides now, and losing on both. One morning, as he looked at himself in the mirror, Ethan barely recognized the man staring back. The shadow of Judy still followed him, but the memory of her guided him. What was right now felt hollow. What was forbidden, irresistible. He knew what would happen when he was discovered, but he no longer cared. Some men are born to serve, others to be lost. And that night, as rain once again fell over the city, he walked to her empire's headquarters and waited. Not for orders, not for a mission. He waited for her. And when Isabella entered, silent as always, he looked at her straight on. No words, no lies. Just a single moment of truth between two enemies who had already fallen in love. The night was thick, and the city pulsed like a fevered body. The sound of rain against the windows mixed with the hum of engines and the faint echo of hurried footsteps. Isabella stepped into the warehouse with the poise of someone unafraid of the dark. The wet floor mirrored her silhouette, the black dress clinging to her skin like a living armor. Around her, armed men awaited her command, but her eyes searched for something else, and then she found it. Ethan was there, leaning against a stack of crates, hands in his pockets, carrying the calm of a man with too many secrets. They locked eyes, and time seemed to lose its rhythm. There was no music, yet the air vibrated as if there were. He didn't speak. Neither did she. The silence between them felt almost physical, heavy, tangible. Isabella walked to the center of the warehouse. The click of her heels on concrete slicing through the air like a war metronome. Ethan kept his gaze fixed on her, not out of defiance, but because he simply couldn't look away. She noticed. She noticed the stare, the steadiness, the absence of fear, and it irritated her. There was something indecent in the way he looked at her, as if he could see beyond her skin, beyond the invisible crown. The whole world bowed before her, but he didn't. And paradoxically, that was what held her there. "Are you looking out of curiosity or desire?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp. Ethan gave a brief, dangerous smile. "Instinct," he replied. The air between them grew warmer, despite the cold of the night. Isabella folded her arms, trying to contain the storm rising inside her. He took a step forward, the sound echoing like a challenge. Her body reacted before her mind did. Her heart quickened, beating in a rhythm she hadn't felt since youth. Love and hate traded places inside her without asking permission. "Careful, Mr. Vale," she said softly, her tone cutting like glass. "Not every instinct leads to survival." He let out a faint laugh, the kind that doesn't belong to a man without fear. "And not every queen rules by choice," he answered. The words sealed his fate. For a fleeting instant, Isabella saw something human behind his disguise, and it disarmed her. Her gaze softened, and he saw it. The tension shifted, becoming something else. The distance between them was too small to ignore, too wide to cross without consequence. The sound of rain outside grew louder, as if the world itself was trying to hide what was happening there. Ethan took a deep breath, and the air that left his lips felt like a secret. Isabella took a step back, but he followed her with his eyes, and that was enough to set fire to what little reason remained. The touch never came, but the almost touch burned more than flame. When their eyes met again, there was something there that defied time, duty, and fear. She saw in him not just the enemy, but the mirror, and that recognition frightened her. Isabella turned her face away, but not fast enough. He saw what no one else ever had, her heart struggling to escape from inside its armor. The radio crackled in her ear, reminding her who she was. Orders, reports, distant voices calling for direction. Isabella drew a slow breath, regaining her composure. "We're ready to move," one of her men said through the line. Her answer came firm, steady. "Not yet." The response was automatic, but the reason wasn't. She wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. Ethan took another step, close enough for her scent to reach him, a mix of jasmine, smoke, and power. He no longer knew if the mission even existed. All that remained was that gaze that undid him, that silence that spoke louder than any word. Isabella noticed and looked away, trying to recover control. But inside her, the empire had already begun to crumble, quietly. The meeting ended without touches, without kisses, without wounds. Yet what lingered between them was deeper than any visible mark. As Isabella stepped out of the warehouse, the cold air brushed against her face, and she realized something within her had changed. Danger now had a face, a voice, a name: Ethan Vale. And no matter how hard she tried to deny it, her heart had already made its choice. In the car, on her way back to the palace, she rested her forehead against the window and closed her eyes. The city passed by as a blur of lights and sins. Everything she had built suddenly seemed smaller, more fragile, more human. Outside, her empire slept in peace. But inside her, something had just awakened. And that night, for the first time in years, Isabella didn't think about power, nor revenge. She thought only of him. The following days dragged her soul along the same weary road. Isabella tried to keep her routine intact, her tone steady, her gestures precise, her throne unshaken, but the empire was quietly starting to waver. There was hesitation where once there was command. A flicker of uncertainty between one decision and the next. The men noticed, but no one dared to speak. The walls, however, heard. And the walls knew. She saw him everywhere, in the reflection of her glass, in the shadow down the corridor, in the smoke of a cigarette that never seemed to end. Ethan had become a recurring thought, an addiction. The more she tried to forget him, the more his name crept between the lines of her mind. Isabella, who had always controlled chaos, was now its prisoner. Her heart had begun to move on its own, and no army could stop it. Meetings grew tense. She hesitated before signing contracts, doubted her own allies, missed details she once ruled over effortlessly. The empire demanded coldness, but she burned with fever. At night, when silence swallowed the palace, Isabella wondered when exactly she had lost control, and more painfully, for whom. Ethan still played his role, or at least tried to. He appeared with reports, strategies, advice disguised as loyalty. Isabella pretended to listen as his superior, but every word he spoke cut too deep. Sometimes their eyes met across the table, and time fractured. No one around noticed, but in that brief instant, that stolen heartbeat, everything stopped. One night she called him in to review a document alone. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a lamp. Ethan entered, closed the door behind him, and the click of the lock sounded louder than it should have. Isabella pretended to focus on the papers, but her hand trembled. When she finally looked up, he was already watching her. No words, only breath, and that was enough. She tried to harden herself. "Don't get used to intimacy, Mr. Vale," she said, without looking at him. He stepped closer, slowly, just enough for their shadows to merge on the wall. "It's not intimacy," he murmured, his voice calm but fractured. "It's inevitable." Isabella looked at him for a brief moment, and saw in his eyes the same emptiness she carried inside. For that single heartbeat there was no empire, no enemies, only two survivors trying to understand what was left of themselves. Confusion consumed her. The next day, she cancelled meetings, changed plans, issued contradictory orders. Her allies began to whisper among themselves. "The boss seems different," they said. And they were right. Isabella had changed. The woman who once gave death orders without blinking now hesitated before her own conscience. The empire had begun to feel the weight of its queen's heart. During a dinner with her commanders, she noticed the looks exchanged across the table. The respect was still there, but the fear, the lifeblood of her rule, was fading. And in her world, without fear, nothing stood. Isabella lifted her glass, made a toast without conviction. And as everyone echoed her gesture, she caught her reflection in the wine. The queen was still there, but the empire within her was crumbling. In her room, the mirror showed a tired woman. She touched her own face, trying to recognize herself. Power had left invisible scars. Love, wounds that would never heal. Isabella wondered if she could still separate the one who ruled from the one who felt. The two halves of her were merging, and neither seemed willing to surrender. That night, an urgent call came through. A shipment intercepted. Betrayal imminent. Isabella took a deep breath and tried to react as she always had, with calculation, precision, command. But her thoughts fled elsewhere, to another face. To Ethan. And that's when she understood the depth of her fall. Her mind still gave the orders, but her heart had already deserted. She walked to the window and looked out at the glowing, silent city. The lights below pulsed like artificial constellations. Rain began to fall again. Fine, steady, melancholic. Isabella closed her eyes and whispered something she had never allowed herself to say. His name. The word came out softly, carrying both guilt and relief. By morning, the empire awoke in invisible ruins. Old alliances trembled. Loyal allies exchanged quiet doubts. And she knew why. Because in a world where love is weakness, feeling is treason, Isabella had made the one mistake she had always condemned. She trusted. And now, the iron fortress she had built was melting from the inside, corroded by something she could never control. The storm was forming. Her eyes, reflected in the mirror, still held their old strength, but now they carried something new. Fear, not of the enemy, not of death. The woman who ruled the underworld had fallen for the man who might be her end. And so, on the night when power faltered for the first time, Isabella finally understood. The heart doesn't take orders. It follows only its own ruin. The rain fell hard, heavy, as if the sky itself had grown tired of keeping secrets. Isabella walked down the palace's main corridor, each step echoing like a warning. In her hand, a small recording. The sound of wind mingled with her quickened breathing, and her heartbeat thundered like war drums. The message had arrived hours earlier, delivered by a courier who swore he didn't know its source. When she listened, the ground vanished beneath her. The voice was his. Ethan's. The control room was empty, lit only by the cold glow of the monitors. Isabella pressed play again, as if needing to be sure hell was real. And there it was, the confession. Ethan's voice, low and sharp, speaking to someone unseen. She trusts me. Soon I'll have everything we need. The silence that followed was worse than the words themselves. It was the pause of a man who wasn't lying. Her world, built on iron and discipline, began to crumble. The walls seemed to shift, the lights flickered as if mocking her. Isabella stepped back, then again. She tried to breathe, but the air was too heavy. Love, that quiet intruder, now wore the face of deceit. The woman who once ruled fear was now feeling it for the first time. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white with rage and pain. Memories flooded in, the glances, the soft-spoken words, the almost innocent touch of hands that now felt like weapons. Everything she'd lived with him felt like a lie. And yet, part of her refused to believe it. Part of her still longed for another explanation. When Ethan entered the room, the storm was already raging inside her. He saw it at once, the look in her eyes. It wasn't pure hatred. It was the look of someone who had loved too deeply to bear the truth. Isabella, he said, but her name sounded profane in his mouth. She raised a hand for silence. Don't you dare speak to me as if I were still your ally. Her voice was low, but it carried the weight of every empire she had ever destroyed. Ethan took a hesitant step forward. It's not what it seems. Isabella laughed, a dry, soundless laugh. They all say that, don't they? And yet the truth never changes. She threw the recorder onto the table. His own words filled the room again, haunting, merciless. Ethan froze. There was no excuse left to give. Isabella walked toward him, slow and deliberate, each step a sentence. You came into my world to destroy me, and you did. But what you'll never understand, Ethan, is that I gave you more than an empire. I gave you what was left of me. The silence that followed was unbearable. He tried to speak, but his voice broke. And then she whispered, and that's how you killed what was still human in me. The blow didn't come from her fist, but from her words. Ethan tried to explain, tried to say that nothing had been planned after he met her, that Judy had died the moment love began. But Isabella wasn't listening anymore. Love had become nothing but white noise, distant, empty, unrecognizable. Her heart, once invincible, now bled in silence. She picked up the gun from the table and aimed it at him. There were no tears. Isabella didn't cry. She only trembled, a subtle, fragile tremor born more from her soul than from her body. You could have lied until the end, she said, her voice unsteady. You could have let me believe. But you chose the truth, and the truth hurts more than any bullet. Ethan stood his ground, his tone calm, yet broken. I didn't come here just to arrest you, he said softly. I came to love you. And that destroyed me too. Her gaze shattered, and for an instant they looked like two ruins struggling to stay upright. The gun still pointed, but the decision behind it had vanished. She hated him, yet loved him more than her own pride. The room seemed to spin around them, as if the universe itself were bearing witness to a divine mistake. Ethan took a slow step forward, defying reason. Shoot, he whispered. But know this, if you do, you'll never forget me. She pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The dry click echoed like a sentence being passed. She'd forgotten to unlock it, and in that moment her strength dissolved. The gun fell. The empire fell. She fell. He rushed to her, holding her by the shoulders. I never wanted to hurt you, he said. Isabella lifted her face, her eyes burning with equal parts pain and contempt. Then why come to me, Ethan? Why make me believe I could be loved? He had no answer. There was none that would fit. Only silence. Only tragedy. Outside, the rain grew heavier, thunder muffling the sound of the sobs she tried to suppress. Isabella stepped back slowly, like someone retreating from a minefield. "Get out of my way," she said, her voice low, controlled. "Before I remember, I still know how to shoot." Ethan didn't move. He just stood there, watching the woman who had destroyed him, and somehow saved him too. When she left the room, the sound of her heels merged with the thunder. The recording kept playing, looping endlessly. The same voice, the same wound. "She trusts me. Soon I'll have everything we need." But what no one knew was that he had already lost everything, even his soul. That night, as the storm devoured the city, Isabella understood what love truly was, the most treacherous of enemies. It enters through the door of trust and leaves, taking everything, even what you swore you'd never surrender. Morning came pale and exhausted, as if the sky itself had cried through the night. The city still slept beneath the hangover of the storm. Isabella walked alone through the abandoned factory, the same place where everything had begun. The echo of her footsteps filled the void like a heartbeat outside her chest. In her hand, a gun. On her face, the same iron stare that once ruled the world, now hiding something raw, something human. Pain. Ethan was waiting for her, leaning against a cracked column, his body wounded, his eyes hollow and tired. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried the smell of thunder. When he saw her, he tried to speak, but she raised the gun, slow and deliberate, like a ritual she didn't want to perform. "Don't say anything," she whispered. There's nothing left to say. The silence that followed was too heavy to break. Only the soft dripping of water echoed through the beams. Isabella stepped closer. The gun trembled faintly in her hand, but her gaze stayed unflinching. Ethan didn't move. He simply watched her, as a man does when he's made peace with his fate. "I did lie," he said at last, his voice rough, almost breaking. "But only until the moment I loved you. After that, every word was true." And in that moment, Isabella realized that some truths hurt far more than betrayal, because they arrived too late to save what's already been lost. She laughed, a short, bitter sound that broke the silence like glass. "You destroyed everything, Ethan. The empire, my trust, my faith, and still you dare to speak of love?" He nodded, his gaze steady, unflinching, because love isn't holy, Isabella. It's a curse. We're both trapped in it. Her breathing grew heavier, uneven. Inside, her heart waged war against logic. She stepped closer until the barrel of the gun pressed against his chest. "Tell me it was a lie," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. "Tell me you never loved me, and I'll pull the trigger." Ethan smiled faintly, the kind of smile born from someone who's already lost everything. "I can't lie anymore," he said softly. "I loved you, and that's why I'm ready to die." The words pierced him like a blade, and cut through her just the same. Time froze. Her breath faltered, her finger weakened on the trigger. Ethan lifted his hand slowly, touched the barrel, and gently lowered it. "You weren't born to kill what you love," he murmured. "Neither of us were." Isabella closed her eyes, trying to calm the sea inside her chest. Memories rushed back like a storm, the first glance, the first suspicion, the first silence that hurt. Every detail, every unspoken word, every lie that had sounded like tenderness. It was all there, alive, burning. And among the ashes something still survived, something raw and unbroken, something that refused to die even after everything else had. She shoved him away in anger, her voice trembling. "Why won't you fight?" she cried. "Why don't you hate me?" Ethan stepped closer again, his voice soft as the rain that had finally stopped. "Because hating you would be easier. But loving you was impossible, and I did it anyway. Her breath broke into a fragile, stifled sob. Isabella raised the gun again, but this time the tears came. Silent, pure, unrelenting. The barrel pressed once more against his chest, right over the steady rhythm of his heart. Ethan placed his hand over hers, and the world seemed to stop breathing. "If you're going to shoot," he said quietly, "do it now. But understand this, the bullet will go through us both." She hesitated, and in that hesitation, truth revealed itself. Killing Ethan would mean killing the last trace of humanity still alive in her. Love and hate blurred until they became indistinguishable, two sides of the same wound. Then slowly, she let the gun slip from her fingers. The metallic clang echoed through the warehouse like the closing line of a story written in blood. Ethan reached out and touched her face. Isabella didn't pull away. Their eyes met, and in them wasn't forgiveness, but recognition. Two broken souls who had found each other too late. When they finally embraced, it wasn't for comfort, but confession, a surrender without words. It was the embrace of two people who understood that love, sometimes, is simply the most beautiful way to lose. For a brief moment, the world was still. The rain began again, softly, gently, like applause from fate. Isabella rested her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes. "You destroyed everything," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But somehow, you brought me back." Ethan smiled faintly, the shadow of peace crossing his face. "Then it was worth it." And in that instant, before the sun could rise and the empire could reclaim its debt, Isabella understood, not every love is meant to last. Some come only to teach what it means to feel, and what it means to survive. Dawn didn't bring light that morning, it brought ashes. The sky hung heavy and grey, mirroring the weight in her soul. The streets below were empty, stripped of the pulse that once obeyed her command. The city, once her creation, her reflection, now breathed on its own, disobedient, dismantled, too free. From the high window of the old building that once housed her empire, Isabella watched. Below, cars burned. Distant sirens mingled with the faint echo of screams. The reign of the Iron Queen had fallen. The enemies had waited, silent, patient, watching for the smallest fracture. And when she hesitated, for the briefest moment, because of a man, they struck. A blow from within. Another from outside. Loyalties traded for fear, gold, or vengeance. The corridors that once overflowed with voices now carried only the sound of emptiness. The great iron crest of her empire, once a symbol of control, lay split in two above the main gate. Isabella stared at it, and saw not just the end of her power, but the reflection of her own fractured soul. Ethan was gone. No one knew if he'd been captured, killed, or if he'd simply vanished to spare what little remained of her. Part of Isabella wanted to hate him for it. Another part just wanted him to be alive, somewhere. Love, even when it wounds, never truly dies. It only changes its voice. Now, instead of a heartbeat, she could hear it in the silence. Her former allies tried to fight back, but without her command, the empire dissolved into chaos. Rival factions seized territories. Blood returned to the streets. And fear, once her most obedient servant, had become the city's new ruler. Names that had once sworn loyalty disappeared one by one, leaving trails of betrayal. Isabella watched in silence, her posture steady, but her gaze hollow. Because deep down, she knew this was the cost of love. By afternoon, the main building was on fire. She arrived too late. The stench of gasoline mixed with the metallic bite of scorched steel. The crackling of flames sounded like a requiem. Still, she went inside, alone, unarmed, unguarded. She walked through the inferno like one crossing through memory. Each room she passed was a ghost. Laughter, plans, oaths, now broken. Everything turned to ash before her eyes. At the heart of the great hall, where so many of her decisions had changed the world, she stopped. The ceiling was collapsing, but she didn't move. The red glow of the fire danced across her face, turning unseen tears into light. Isabella closed her eyes and let the heat come closer. For a moment she wished the fire would take her too. But fate, cruel and merciful as ever, wasn't done with her yet. A nearby explosion threw her to the ground. The sound tore through the air. Shards of concrete and glass rained around her. She lay still, uncertain if she was still alive. When her eyes opened, she saw the sky, the same sky that once looked down on her power, now shrouded in smoke. She tried to rise, but her body felt impossibly heavy. Around her, the city burned. And for the first time, Isabella realized the world could go on without her. Men came running to pull her from the wreckage, but she refused. "Leave," she said, her voice hoarse, broken. "This is mine." It was no longer a command, it was a farewell. The empire she had built with iron and blood was crumbling before her eyes. And nothing, not love, not vengeance, could save it. Kneeling amid the ruins, Isabella pressed her hand into the warm dust and felt the texture of the end. The wind blew, carrying a burnt piece of paper to her feet. It landed softly, blackened and torn, a fragment of an old document bearing Ethan's signature. Isabella picked it up and stared at it for a moment before smiling, a bitter, almost peaceful smile. "Even fire remembers," she whispered. And in that moment, the last trace of hatred vanished. The love that once destroyed her was now the only thing keeping her alive, because it was all that remained. When the flames finally died, the empire was gone. The streets that once bent at the sound of her name now belonged to chaos. Isabella rose slowly, covered in ashes, her gaze fixed on the horizon. No crown, no glory. Only a woman. One who had lost everything, and somehow found herself among the ruins. She stepped out of the building, and the weak, hesitant sun broke through the clouds. Ashes swirled around her in soft spirals, dancing like veils. The world had forgotten her, but the city, silent, wounded, alive, seemed to whisper the name no one dared to say anymore. Isabella. Not Lorena, just Isabella. And in that instant she understood. Some falls aren't punishment, they're freedom. Night returned quietly, as if the world itself had grown tired of screaming. The fires that had consumed the city were gone, leaving behind only smoke, soot, and the bitter scent of endings. Isabella walked through the ravaged streets, her coat torn, her hair tangled by the wind. Each step echoed faintly, reminding her of what she had lost. The empire, the power, the fear. Everything was gone. All that remained was her, and a pain that now felt strangely peaceful. The iron-colored sky released a thin drizzle, washing over the wreckage. The soft patter of rain on the debris sounded like a heartbeat. Isabella stopped in front of a half-collapsed warehouse, the same place where it had all begun. She walked in slowly, like someone returning to a sacred place. The air still smelled of smoke. Shadows trembled across the broken walls. And then, through the silence, a familiar voice broke the distance. "I knew you'd come." She turned slowly. Ethan was there, alive, wounded, but standing. His face was scarred by war, his hands trembling, his eyes still the same. For a second, she thought it was an illusion, that her weary mind had conjured a ghost to soothe the ache. But when he stepped forward, her heart answered before her thoughts could. Neither of them spoke for a while. There was too much to say, and no words that could hold it. Isabella looked at him, and every scar on his body seemed to mirror one of her own. The love between them had been fire, destructive, uncontrollable, necessary. Now only embers remained, faint, glowing, enough to warm a final goodbye. Ethan came closer until only a few steps separated them. "I tried to protect you," he said, his voice rough, fragile. "But there was no way to win without losing you." Isabella drew a long breath. "You could have lied one more time. It would have been easier." He smiled faintly, sadness in his eyes. You're the one who taught me not to lie, even when the truth hurts. The wind swept through the warehouse, lifting the dust into the air. Isabella lowered her gaze. I lost everything, Ethan. My empire, my allies, my story. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as it touched her face. No, he said softly. You found something no one could ever give you. You found what it means to feel. The words echoed through the silence, and for a moment the weight she carried seemed to vanish. They embraced, a simple gesture, yet it held the gravity of every mistake, every wound, every truth they had tried to deny. The rain grew heavier, falling over them like a baptism, washing away the past, the blood, the fear. Isabella pressed her forehead against his chest, listening to the heartbeat that still defied the ruins around them. It was real. It was the end, and somehow, the beginning. What now? She asked, her voice barely more than breath. Ethan looked toward the horizon, where the city was slowly being reborn from the grey. Now we live, he answered. Even if it's far away. Even if it hurts. She nodded, and for the first time in a long while she smiled, not the smile of a queen or a warrior, but of a woman who had finally understood that love and ruin can walk side by side. The sound of sirens began again in the distance. Isabella looked one last time at the man who had both destroyed and saved what was left of her. She touched his hand gently, then let go. Go, she said, before the world remembers us. Ethan hesitated, his eyes locked on hers, then turned and walked away without looking back. The rain didn't stop. Each drop felt like a slow, deliberate period written by fate itself. Alone, Isabella stood in the silence, watching the emptiness around her. The wet walls reflected fragments of who she had been, the leader, the lover, the survivor, the woman, and the myth. She whispered his name softly, like a prayer lost to time. The sound blended with the rain, and the city seemed to answer, a distant, gentle, endless murmur. That night, among the ruins of the empire and the echo of the love that almost destroyed her, Isabella understood. Some stories don't end with victory or forgiveness. They end with understanding. And perhaps that is the rarest form of redemption. They say time erases everything, but there are names the wind refuses to carry away. Isabella is one of them. Years pass since the fall of the empire, and the city that once knelt at her feet now lives in silence, keeping its secrets like wounds that never heal. Some swear they've seen her at the docks at dusk, walking alone. A dark scarf over her face, her eyes lost somewhere beyond the sea. Others claim she died that night, that the fire consumed everything, including her. But legends have a life of their own, and Isabella's only grew stronger. It spread through the alleys, through whispered stories in dimly lit bars. The old ones say there's a woman who helps those no one else dares to see. The same woman who once ruled through fear. In the taverns they say Lorena still lives, and that every time a woman rises from the ground, it's her spirit that helps her stand again. The truth was lost among the ashes, but the myth never stopped breathing. Some old policemen still keep her file locked away, full of reports, dates, suspicions, unanswered questions. None of them ever close the case. Because you can't end what you never truly understood. Isabella wasn't just a criminal. She wasn't just a lover. She was the reflection of the city itself, beautiful and brutal, tender and deadly. And those who look long enough into the shadows still feel her presence, like a scent the years could never erase. Once, a fisherman said he saw a woman sitting at the edge of the pier, watching the sunrise as if she were waiting for the sea to return something it had taken. He said she seemed to be talking to the waves, whispering secrets the wind carried away. When he got closer, she turned and smiled, a soft, sad, almost serene smile. "Have you ever loved something that destroyed you?" she asked, her voice calm and quiet. The man hesitated before answering yes. She looked back at the horizon and said, just before disappearing into the fog, "Then you're still alive." No one ever saw her again. The name La Reina became a whisper carried by the wind, part warning, part prayer. To some, she was a symbol of power and strength. To others, a reminder that love is the most dangerous empire of all. And perhaps, in the end, that was what made her eternal. Not what she conquered, but what she felt. When night falls and the rain begins, people swear they can hear slow footsteps echoing through the narrow alleys. Some say they've seen a woman's silhouette moving through the wet reflections, walking like an old shadow that refuses to fade. They say that when the thunder splits the sky, she smiles. And somewhere, far from the city that once feared her and then forgot her, Isabella still watches the world in silence, guarding what remains of love and forgiveness. And so the myth becomes memory, and the memory becomes legend, because there are women who are not born to be remembered. They are born to never be forgotten. She once ruled the empire of crime, but love was the only territory she could never conquer. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notifications, and keep following our stories of love, redemption, and fate.